Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane. I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library in Massachusetts, and I'm very excited to be here with Ricardo Diseño and Steve Mockus of Eerie Legends. I mean, what could be better on a Halloween, month? Because now it's become a month, right? In fact, I think I saw Halloween candy out in August, so it's really like an entire season. So, I want before we get started with the talk about their amazing book, I want to just say a couple of things. So thanks to the Friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting all of our programming. And we couldn't do all of all of this stuff without them, as well as to Ricardo and Steve, who let us share this program with other libraries. And, like I always tell people, when libraries work together, we make magic. You can buy signed books by Ricardo and Steve from Aesop's Fable, our very favorite indie bookstore. And I'll send a link to everybody after the talk with how to do that. And Ricardo and Steve are going to be talking for a little while with slides. You are welcome to put any thoughts you have in the chat. If you have questions for them, please put them in the Q&A and I will moderate them. And then we'll have time at the end also for questions. So feel free to throw out whatever comes up in your up for you. So Ricardo and Steve. Ricardo is an artist. Steve is a writer. They put together Eerie Legends, and they have like a fascinating story of how they came together to make this book. I'm going to like hand it over to you to tell us a little bit about yourself, but I do want to say that when I reached out to Ricardo to do this talk, I think you were one of the fastest people that ever responded to me.
Well, like I said, this is the first time I'm talking about this book, so I was pretty excited to jump on
I
it.
am very excited that we have this opportunity to talk about this book with you and be the first. So this book did just come out recently. So if you have cake at home, feel free to bring it out for a book birthday. Ricardo, Steve, welcome. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Thanks. Thanks for inviting us.
Absolutely. So I'm going to go off screen and I'll come back or moderate those questions as they come through.
All right, cool.
Ricardo, do you want to introduce yourself and then I'll introduce me and then you can start your
Yes.
slide presentation?
Yeah, my name is Ricardo. I am an illustrator. I went to school in New York. I grew up in Miami. I met Steve because me and my partner moved to San Francisco, and then I was working for a pop-up book designer named Matthew Reinhardt. I don't know, have you ever met Matthew, Steve?
I
He did
haven't, but he's the person that designs. He's the guru
like
of
a big
pop-up. Yeah,
pop-up book
incredible stuff.
designer guy.
Yeah.
And I used to work for him. And he had a meeting at Chronicle, and then he took me with him because I was his assistant at the time. And then I got the internship working there. And then I met Neil, who's like also another editor working on all of our projects, and he's really great. And he helped me produce a lot of like my proposals that I first sent to you guys.
Mhm.
And that's how I met you, because we both liked horror movies, because I kept making a bunch of stuff about horror stuff.
Right.
And
Right.
I was told you were the guy to talk to.
Yeah, yeah. You and I trade horror movie recommendations all the time. So, my name's Steve Mockus. I'm an editor based in San Francisco. Grew up in the Bay Area, San Jose, 50 miles south. School at UC Berkeley. Graduated in English. Had a bunch of 26 years ago, internships were unpaid. Now they tend to be paid, which is great. And so I had a bunch of unpaid internships at publishers and including Chronicle. I contributed some text for a couple books that were published as an intern, and then went to San Francisco State for a creative writing degree, mainly because I wasn't finding any jobs that I wanted. Temped for years. Graduated in the early no late 90s, and went through about 7 interviews at Chronicle and finally got my entry level job in sort of pop culture book publishing, which was my dream. And so I've just hung on ever since. So I've been here the whole time. And so my job is to come up with book ideas and then find creators who have ideas and want to get published, whether they have an agent or not. And met Ricardo
Thank
through
God.
working. It's really important to work with people who, no matter where they're coming from, and So Ricardo was within the Chronicle family, working with us, and it was brimming with ideas for projects. Um, and we were chatting horror, and then he had a bunch of pitches, and then we'll get to the point where the first one came up as before this, but and
So
here
this
we
book,
are.
yeah, this book has been a long time coming. So it's like a collection of it's really like kind of cryptids and ghosts, right? There's one haunted house and there's
Yeah,
aliens
the
too.
the first draft, as I remember it, was a few more haunted places, but we kind of dialed into like creatures that could get you,
Uh-huh.
and so yeah, it's creepy creatures, paranormal folklore from around the world. So it's like cryptids, ghosts, demons, um, one digital cryptid that
Right.
I never heard of.
Like,
Had you, were you the one that came up with the Loab?
yeah, well, all I do is like listen to paranormal podcasts and stuff. So I just like write them down.
Uh,
I have a big collection of like stories to draw stuff about. So it was pretty easy to like compile all this information pretty fast.
yeah.
It was fun. It was fun to do. All right, so want to get into it?
Yeah, I should point out that the cover glows in the dark. So
Sure
that's what you're
does.
looking at. That's what you're looking at on the side there.
Yeah, also a suggestion from Matthew. When I first showed him the pitch for this book, he said he was the one who thought about the campfire idea to like make it like glow in the dark and like have it more like a narrative and a fiction section,
Mhm.
which was always he always has good ideas. All right, so this started off. This has been a book that I always wanted to make. Like I kind of when I first met Steve and when I was working at Chronicle, it was kind of the first time I got into thinking that I could actually make books. And for a long time, the only book I wanted to make was this, which was just like a paranormal nonfiction book with like crazy illustrations. I had this classic spooky stories growing up, and it was like tattered because I would just always be reading it, and it pretty much fell apart, and I loved it so much. And then these came later, like the ghosts and monster books, and they were just so cool from like the 80s and just like crazy illustrations and just like weird and strange stories that like you couldn't really, I don't know, like I guess you can kind of see them like on the History Channel, but
Yeah.
those kind of
Nowadays, the History Channel, yes, but
right, Ancient Aliens channel. Pretty, I mean, pretty much is what they talk about. But I don't know, when it's in a book, it just feels so much cooler than the like weird mockumentary things that they do. So the first pitch I sent to Steve when I first met him was this one, which was the it was the most haunted place in each state in America. So like this one is the Waverly's Hills Sanitarium, and I think that's in Kentucky, and it's like a sanitarium that people like died in. It became like a tuberculosis ward, and like tons of different things happened there. And then, whatever. It was like a concept, a ghost concept that I don't know, like we were talking about for a while, and then it just kind of disappeared. I don't know what happened to it, but it was, pretty cool. We talked about Chronicle. And I think that's when you guys kind of really got I got on the radar with like me talking to you with this.
well,
Um,
and we were floored by your drawing style. We were like, we got to find something to work with Ricardo on. I mean, people could see these sketches here. They're tremendous. And then, you know, so we were just trying to figure out something to do together.
yeah, it was this was really still in the time before I did anything digital too. So I was like trying to do things just straight up drawing and painting. But I think like the next when we did the horror oracle, it was I just had to scrap it and just go straight to digital after like sketching it all.
Mhm.
So this was like the concept for that, which was like still nonfiction. It was just ghosts, nonfiction stuff. But then that didn't work. So then I did this one, which I still think is pretty good. It's an ABC book of horror movies, and they're all like really cheesy little sayings about like different movies. Like S is for stage, where the ghost makes a singer a star. T is for tricycle, writing in a door ajar. So that's the Phantom of the Opera and The Shining. So then me and Steve started talking about horror movies, and then this came up, which was a formula or a structure that they had before the Oracle deck, and then infusing that with like a classic horror um, movies, which I think is pretty good. A gift that keeps on giving because we keep making it into different stuff, which is fun.
Yeah, so the thought process for the ghosts, it was focused as American and state by state, and we thought that's still interesting. I mean, Ricardo and I are still talking about that, but like um we got excited about international, that it just kind of that started be one of the things that we were talking about. And then for the ABC book, there have been quite a few. There's like a punk rock ABC. There's various ABC books, and from my perspective, where I can see book sales, there was sort of an upper limit to how well they would do, no matter how well executed. And so we thought that idea was cool, but we were trying to figure out something that wouldn't have that sort of parameter. And Chronicle Books, for anybody who doesn't know, and why necessarily would you, we publish about 400 or 500 projects a year, books, note cards, calendars, decks, all kinds of stuff, mostly books, but we also have this sort of ancillary product line, and Oracle decks and tarot decks, not just for us, but all over the place, have been doing really well. A lot of those are very positively framed, because that's sort of the vibe, And but we thought that taking Ricardo's interests and marrying them with that format would be something unusual. And we knew that our accounts that we reach were interested in Oracle. They have a whole stack of Oracle decks somewhere in their stores. And we sell Chronicle sells not just to bookstores, but to shops that will carry some books, but also other things. The books are part of your life, and decks also. And so we thought that this would be an opportunity to kick out the jams and get it out farther. And so that was the idea.
It was a fun one. I also was like huge into like Mondo and
Mhm.
all like the alternative horror or just movie poster people. So this was like a godsend that I got this project because it was so fun to do.
So it's 50 cards, 50 classic and new classic horror movies. There's a phrase that's sort of pertinent to each of the cards that you use for your oracular activities. There's instructions for doing readings, and there's a booklet that goes along, and
Which Steve wrote.
which I
So
wrote, which I
yeah,
wrote.
that was like our first real, like Hugh helped edit it, but he also was like the beginning of us like writing, which
Yeah.
I get a lot of people telling me that they love the writing in that book.
Well, thank God. I don't want to screw it up. But like, so my job as an editor would be to hire somebody to do it, and I just didn't want to give it away. I just didn't want to give this gig to somebody else. I wanted to do it, so I did end up doing it.
I'm glad you did. Okay, let's go back a little bit. So, so I was doing this one while I was making this one. I wanted to keep doing that spooky book idea, which I wanted to do, which my mom says was always the book I wanted to do. So I did this drawing, which was crazy, and it was a search and find drawing, but it was supposed to be each cryptid would have like a really elaborate drawing. So this is the skunk ape, and he's in Florida, and I'm from Florida, so he was very important to me. And he's like sitting in the front. He's really like smelly, and all these people and like like doing stuff around them. So it was the first time I was like, maybe this book should be more focused on like specific creatures instead of places, like the American Hauntings one was pretty erratic. Like there was a lot of stuff going on that didn't really, there was like not much of an anchor. So this was kind of like now focusing on like specific monsters or like cryptids and thinking about how they relate in their time and their spaces. So like the skunk ape would be in Florida and like think about who would be there and like what are they like wearing and what they're doing and stuff. So this was the first pitch I sent Steve. And this was pretty similar to how it ended up being. Like a lot of the drawings stayed at least the structures of a lot of the drawings stayed. And I originally wanted it to be like a huge poster. I always kind of want to do like big screen print posters. So the idea of the book was going to be like huge, like elaborate drawings with like text inside of it. So then each spread would be like the ex like the fiction part of like the campfire story, and then it would be like little bits of like where the backstory of it and how it fit into history and like the people who made it, and a little bit more of like a just a nonfiction research part of it, like those two merging together in this like big illustrated landscape. So I mean, we did a pretty good job sticking with that. There's not too much that differs from it from the original.
We entertained making a giant oversized book at one point, but I have had an experience publishing in the oversize, and certainly librarians will likely sympathize, but bookstores in particular have like a shelf height. And if you're not within their shelf height, then your project gets put above anybody's eye line. It's very tough. And we didn't want to have that happen, as cool as that would be. Because whenever I print this stuff out, I print it out at like 11 by 17. And I'm like, it's great. But we couldn't do a 17-inch tall project because it couldn't get shelved. So then we moved to a more traditional size.
Yeah, I think I'm just gonna have to make big books on my own, just like big screen print books, which I
I
used to do
do,
in
I,
college.
Ricardo, I do think you should be selling posters of the artwork, the key art, the main, you know.
Yeah, I could put it on my website, I guess. I do have a lot of them. I should utilize them for something. Inspo, Milton Glaser, he was a big one. I love him. I don't know if, I mean, I'm sure, he was pretty big in the 60s, 70s, even 80s, but this like in the 60s was kind of like where I was always looking, where it was just like sprawling graphic people and very dynamic and just like that psychedelic look. And then with these kind of stories, it would work to be, like kind of surreal and crazy. So here's the sketches. So each one started off with, I would do the research for a bunch of them, for all of them. And then I'd like just do like very loose research. And then I'd put it in a Google Doc with Steve. And then I would draw these like a fast, kind of like at first glance, kind of like a movie poster of like the whole lore of it. And then Steve would read through it, and then he would write his fiction part of it and do more research for like to make the nonfiction part really cohesive. And then after this was done and we like finalized this and we like got to a point where we thought the sketches were good, I would do all like the secondary type and like the borders and the spot illustrations kind of corresponding with how he wrote the fiction part, which I think was a great way to do it because it really merged all those things together to feel like it was kind of growing, as we were going along.
Mhm.
That was pretty cool. I never did a book like that before. I never really made a book like at this scale with like this level of collaboration. Well, I guess I have, but I haven't finished one before.
Yeah,
And
it was fun.
yeah. So those are sketches. Oh, here are some sketches that didn't end up getting in the book. We made a couple, like a bunch of them that just like didn't go for other stuff. So the
I
Axeman in
can,
New Orleans.
yeah, I mean, I can say like getting into the research for some of these, they certainly fit this sort of like creepy stories and whatever. But the Axeman of New Orleans, if I remember it correctly, was basically just celebrating a mass murderer.
Yeah, I mean they
Serial
really
killer,
there are
you know.
reasons why we didn't do it, obviously.
Yeah.
And actually these are probably the most controversial ones, which is glad I put them in the slides.
Yeah, no, it's interesting to talk about. The Spring Hill Jack was like,
A
I don't know,
rapist,
attacking
really.
women in a way that, eh.
Yeah, I know.
Like, no thanks. We're not going to celebrate that one. And then the Yeti, so Chronicle prints a lot of its printing in China, as do many publishers who print in color. And in recent years, the Chinese government has been more and more restrictive about what they will allow, even in printed products that do not stay within China. The government printing presses have relationships with the Chinese government, and so they are nervous about the Chinese government's response to their activities. And so the Yeti is Tibet based, and we would have had the Chinese government refuse to print the book if we mentioned the word Tibet. And we had an overflow of ideas from Ricardo, and because we printed the book with a special process where some of the colors are hit with a special process color that's different than four color printing. That's why the book looks so like neon. We wanted to go with a printer that knew how to do that, and that printer, we have print relationships all over the world, but the printer that we knew that knew how to do that was in China. So we just picked another creature for this one, and we don't always feel great about that kind of thing. We will definitely print things in other countries if we need a map, and the map has to say what we think map should say. We will print it outside of China if there's anything that's about like a person's biography. Like there's an artist doing a book right now where the artist's biography, she says that she's a Taiwanese Hong Konger based whatever. Immediately, we're not printing that one in China, and we're not going to ask her to change her biography because you wouldn't do that. But in this case, we have 100 creatures to pick from, and we just decided to take the path of least resistance and go
Yeah, I
with
mean,
we knew could
totally
print
makes
it
sense
in
that we didn't
this
use any of
knockout color palette that Ricardo wanted to do and that we wanted to do. So
Yeah, it makes sense that we didn't use any of these. It's just I think it was part of the
well, it's
process.
interesting. It's interesting. Yeah.
Um, totally love that we didn't use these. Okay, so here are some finals. So pretty much for each one, I try to think of like I was saying before, like what the vibe is. Really, it's like try to think of the vibes here, and just like so. This is La Chusa, which is Mexican, and it's like from like the border towns from like Mexico and Texas. So you try to like incorporate this like desert landscape, but then also keep it pretty surreal. And her story was all about this witch who turns into an owl, like a huge owl that like eats drunk men when they come home from the bar, which is great. And she sounds like a crying baby. Um, so great story. So then like I try to like for the type, I looked at like the California like taco truck type, like that they paint on like the taco trucks, which are great. And like I try to look up a lot of like free domain, like very old, like cultural photos from just like all these different places and try to like incorporate that into kind of like that collage kind of thing where you just like juxtapose two different things next to each other and then it becomes like a whole surreal thing, you know? So like flying owl lady next to like a baby crying, a head of a baby crying, to just kind of make a very eerie, very strange setting, to kind of convey that, like, eerie,
Mhm.
kind of, um, I don't know, mood. It was pretty like kind of, making these things were like stream of consciousness, where you just like get all this information and you just kind of like throw a bunch of stuff into drawing and then see what sticks and see what doesn't and see if it helps with the narrative or not. Um, which is pretty much how I always work. It's very loose and very like free flowing. Um, and it is like I do think about, what how it all relates to each other, but sometimes it's better to just think like you leave some things unseen and make it like, bigger that way, like with all the black and negative space and stuff.
Mhm. Should
Um,
should we describe who Krampus is to anybody who doesn't know?
yeah. Krampus is like the Santa antithesis, and he like punishes kids in Sweden. And I put this in here because this is my favorite writing that you did.
Oh, thanks.
That poem, the night before Christmas one, amazing.
Thank
Inspired.
you. That was yeah. So I wrote the most of the so the entries are structured so that there's like a kicker at the top, and then sort of the folklore, nonfiction, although sometimes the nonfiction is skeptical. Um, and then there's a final page which has a like you meet the creature or whatever, like short horror fiction. And this one is a Krampus version of "Twas the Night Before Christmas," which I'm glad to hear you say that you liked it. I worked really hard on that.
I like
But,
it a lot. Yeah. It was inspired, truly inspired.
thank you. And then so one of the things that we do when so the spot illustration, so there's like the Krampus hands with the switch that he hits the bad kids with, puts them in a sack and takes them down to hell. And the main illo doesn't have him holding the switch. It's an important part of the illustrations, and we didn't want to change the main illo. It's great. So we had the opportunity to have the spot illustration pick up another part of the story.
Yeah, the spots are really fun to do. I have a slide about spots here.
Oh, great.
Because I this was like a great what this was actually a really fun thing to do because I never did this before. And I do a lot of editorial stuff for like magazines and things, and this kind of reminded me of that, where it came from your writing. Like these, mine, the big ones were kind of like the beginning of it, but then all of these came from your writing. And it was like kind of interpreting those themes and your ideas and your stories and kind of like picking little sections of it and making like little like comic, little spots. And I thought they were pretty cool.
Yeah,
I
I
have
love that.
a lot of funny references to make and making it really graphic, which is always fun with me. Here's another one, The Catacombs, which I love this one because it's just like so heavy metal and crazy.
This one, I'd been to the catacombs a few years previous, and I either didn't see or didn't read the signs that said, so the catacombs are beneath the streets of Paris, and there's like I don't forget offhand how many millions of bones are there in an ossuary, and the public facing parts, the bones are displayed from the very beginning. They imagined it as sort of an aesthetic experience. So there are piles of femurs and piles of skulls and all sorts of sort of artistic flourishes. And so if one takes a tour, you walk among the bones, and there's nothing between you and the stacks of bones. And uh, dumb person that I was sort of surprised that they weren't telling me not to touch the bones. I'm sure they were. And anyway, so I was like, oh, a femur. So I pick up a femur and touch it, and I'm like, wow, it's really light, like everybody says. And then I pick up a skull, and I am holding it and thinking, wow, I hope this is the only time I ever get to hold a skull, and then put it down. And then right after that, I saw for the first time the sign that's like, don't touch, don't touch the bones. Um, but I was glad I
You
had
might
the
have that drawing in there because of
I
your
was
story.
glad yeah, yeah, totally. And so I was glad I had the experience, and that not least of which now, because I put in the horror fiction, I have some clown go down to the catacombs and touch the bones, and he pays a terrible price.
Yeah, those catacombs are wild.
Yeah,
I don't, kind of crazy. I kind of want to go, but it's pretty wild to think
that's
about.
really cool. You should go.
I want to go. Uh, Loab. So this one just had to be in there because it's like kind of the new one. So with all these, you kind of, I wanted to show like a really diverse group of things that show like many different cultures, many different people, many different times. So this is like the most modern one where it's this AI ghost that lives in our computers. And it's really crazy if you like read about it. Like apparently AI, when you do like after a while of like searching or like creating images, this woman pops up and she's like, this is like really scary lady. And people have theorized that she's just like a ghost in the machine. And I don't, I've done this and like I love scary stories and stuff, but I think that most of these stories are really just like encompasses the anxieties of a certain time period. And they're very
Yeah.
creative and surreal. Um, just narratives about like what people are scared of. Um, and it's a very interesting way that people choose to see the world, if you believe it. And I think time lends it, like the older stories, you kind of like have become just mythic, like vampires, they're in here. And they start off as like during the plague, and like the bodies would like expand with blood, and like the blood would pour out of their mouth. So then the village people thought that the dead bodies were coming up and like sucking on people's blood and then going back in the pile because they didn't know that when you decompose, you expand. And just because you're just like surrounded by dead bodies in this town square, so like this myth happens. Um, it's just like a crazy mirror of the times, and horror movies too, you know. That's why I love horror movies, because it's kind of like the modern
Mhm.
horror of
Modern
today.
myth. So yeah, I didn't know that vampires started out super creepy and only got classy later on, with like the elegant stuff. So yeah, it's the way the bodies would it would expose fingernails and teeth and like the things that you think about when you think of a physical description of a vampire was happening and people were seeing it because there were bodies everywhere. And yeah, I feel like to your point, Ricardo, that a lot of these stories are sort of making things physical that are scary and kind of intangible. So the plague is coming from vampires and you see the bodies around, or the plague is a Norwegian woman named La Pesta who shows up at your doorstep and sweeps away like either your village or your whole family. And that's how you understand what the plague is. It's like easier to deal with,
Yeah.
uh, to think that it's like a thing, you know.
Yeah. I mean, it's always easier to think it's a thing than like human error,
or
mass human
or,
error.
or germs or
Disaster. Yeah. Oh, and Skunk Ape, which is probably my favorite one. He's just so crazy. My ode to Florida. He's like just a monkey. He's pretty much like the Bigfoot, but he lives in the swamps of Florida and he really stinks.
Mhm. One of the things that I enjoyed like going down the path of like the creatures that you'd picked is like how much regional pride different areas take in their cryptids. It's mostly the cryptids. So like yeah, there's the skunk ape, which has a skunk ape like research center that you can go to and buy license plates and skunk ape hands and whatever. Everybody's just kind of enjoying it. There's the Mothman, of course, in Point Pleasant, Virginia. There's a museum and a famous sculpture in front of the museum, and the Jersey Devil. Of course, there's a hockey team, the Devils, and the Chupacabra, and sort of Puerto Rican pride in the chupacabra as sort of a scrappy, you can't keep them down like
Yeah.
underdog, like I'd say there's sort of a pride thing around the chupacabra that I think is it's neat. Yeah.
The Chupacabra is, I think, one of the more elusive ones because he is new too. Like he just came out in the 90s. And he kind of just, I don't know what people think about him, you know?
I think he's farther back than that. I can't, it's been a while since I wrote the text, but one of the things that I thought was really interesting was there was somebody who, so they find chupacabra bodies every so often. Usually they're like mangy dogs or something. And there was a woman who said that she had seen the chupacabra. There were a lot of sightings at some various points in times. And she described the chupacabra um, in such a way that it was pretty easy. I cite in the references in the back of the book, there's somebody who wrote a whole book about chupacabras and other people who've researched the claims. And so she described the chupacabra in such a way that it was easy to track back to. It was an exact description, basically, of the creature that H.R. Giger designed in the movie Species.
Mhm.
I don't know how many people have.
You just
Have you
saw it
seen
on
that one,
TV.
Ricardo?
Huh?
Have you seen that one, Species?
Actually, I never saw Species.
It's hard to recommend necessarily, but it has an H.R. Giger creature that looks exactly like her description of what the chupacabra looked like. And there was a reporter who went and connected the dots. I thought that was fascinating. I didn't know that.
Yeah, but that just happened in the 90s, you know? Like there was like those, like there were goats that were being drained of blood in Puerto Rico. And then like a year later, or I guess maybe it was like the late 80s, and then
I think
90s is
yeah, I'm gonna
when
look
this
it up.
lady came up. It was pretty recent. It wasn't past the 80s. He's a pretty new guy. Because I also
It's
have you
new talent.
do you listen to Coast to Coast
I
with
have, I have.
Nori?
1975, and then pick it up again in the 90s. So you're right. Like there was some early stuff, and then the 90s, kid of the 90s,
But
Chupacabra.
like look how crazy he is. Like everyone knows him. And it's just like a random lady talked about it and they don't even know what happened. Really captured the imagination of the people.
Well, there's t-shirts. Anyway, yeah, Chupacabra.
And that's it. That's the end of the slideshow, everybody. I don't know.
Yep, I'm coming back.
Okay.
I'm making my way in. Um, I was just putting a link in the chat for Aesop's Fable because somebody asked where to buy the book, but you can also get them from the library. Well, I know we have a copy. Yeah, of course we do.
It's cool.
Okay, so Ricardo, would you like to end your slideshow and then we can talk a little bit?
Yeah. How do I,
Oh, just hit stop share.
is it on here?
I can do,
Oh
I
God.
can do it.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Thank
Oh my goodness.
you.
Okay, so I want to remind people that you can put questions in the Q&A and I will ask Ricardo and Steve. And if you want to just chat with each other, I've opened up the chat so you can all um, share your horror stories, really. So I have to ask, did you said that you started reading like scary stories that, in the dark and, the sort of early ones. So were you always, Ricardo, a horror fan?
Yeah, I liked the cheesy Halloween stuff when I was really little, obviously,
Mhm.
like the Disney Channel stuff. And my brother and my sister are 10 years older than me, so there was always like horror movies around, you know?
Mhm.
And we were really into watching horror movies and like I loved it. Well, no, I was really scared. When I was like, because I started really watching it when I was like maybe 7 or 8, so that was
Oh.
like pretty young.
Mhm.
And I remember like Michael Myers and Halloween like really scared me, and I couldn't sleep for like months because I would just always think he was all over the place. But I don't know, like after a while, I think I like it because it was so visceral, you know? Like
Mhm.
it was a medium of film that like really stuck with me and I couldn't really shake it. So then I got really interested in it. And then I started watching like all the classics and when I was in high school and yeah. And just like, I don't know, the art around all of it. And it's always like horror movies are just like these strange little surreal, like a good one at least. Like you never know what's going to happen next, and it's just great. I'm like a fanatic, but I guess I've always been interested in it. I just kind of grew with it, you know.
Mhm.
These
So
are
yeah,
Yeah.
Ricardo, did your siblings like show things to you, or were they just on and you wandered through and you're like, what's that? Or how?
Yeah, they were just on most of the time, and I'd be like kind of in the back, like looking like behind the wall, being like, "Oh God!" And then like I'd run around, and then I'd come back, and I'd look at it again.
Well, of course, that's what kids do, especially when their older siblings are doing something that seems maybe like they shouldn't be. Steve, is that the Beatles up there? They look sort of horrific, like they're like tacked to the walls.
So Chronicle 25 years ago published a book called The Beatles Anthology. I don't know if people will remember, but there was like a moment where there were albums with new songs and there was a TV documentary series and then a big book. And so we published that. And so I'm in the fellow who runs Chronicle Books' office because he's not here and my cubicle is less interesting than the Beatles light. So I'm in here. Yeah.
Well, we
Um,
just saw a Beatles retrospective, so that kind of caught my eye.
mhm.
I'm kind of curious about what you said about horror and being diverse with it, because it seems like, you told these stories from literally all over the world. So why is horror and being scared like a thing that happens all over the world? What do we get out of it that crosses cultures?
I think there's the thing that leaps to mind, and people often say it, but I think because it's true, is there's a sense of catharsis.
Mhm.
Mhm.
There's a sense of also applying an explanation to something that's uncanny, like they just don't understand, and so come up with a colorful way of explaining it. And I think that crosses cultures, and I feel like things that scare people across cultures. I thought that was an interesting. There were through lines where every culture is kind of scared of the dark, generally, and things like that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
some of these stories are like explaining horrible things, but a lot of them are morality tales, you know?
Mhm.
So
That's right.
like it like talks about you shouldn't do this because there's a creature that lives in a tree and it's gonna rip your head off, you know?
Yep.
So
Yeah,
like
and
people
yeah,
like kind
and
of stand
sometimes
there,
and
playing.
sometimes the creatures take a vengeance that humans don't have accessible to them, like let choose a that most of the times that I was writing up the nonfiction or folklore pieces, I'd have to say in one telling or in another telling, because often if they're very old, there are different threads, and a lot of this stuff is sort of like stories told, amongst people, in various circumstances, and so there's not like one version. Um, but for that one, it's always an older woman, I think. Sometimes weirdly, it's like an older woman or a young woman. There are a couple of those, but I think this one is
Well,
always an older woman, kind of like a little bit of an outsider. Um, People accuse her of being a witch or suspect her of being a witch, and that's a through line across every culture
mhm.
is suspicions about fear of women, and especially older or younger women. Um,
Mhm.
and so in this case, it's an older woman who's sort of marginalized, and either she's blamed for being a witch and falsely blamed, or she is a witch, or as in that movie, The Witch, or she's the witch, and then or has a child, her child or a grandchild or something that's killed by a drunk, and
Mm.
so then she's a force of vengeance.
Mhm.
And there's the Pontaniac in Malaysia. That there's this one I think is generally younger women who have been victimized in some way by men, and so they just go and really tear the shreds out of, terrible men, and they can tell who's bad. Like
Mhm.
they're only attacking the dudes who are bad, and so that's something that's some kind of satisfaction that's maybe not easily at hand for people sometimes. So the stories are again cathartic.
And it also sounds like there's elements of power and control in a lot of these situations where sometimes we feel out of control, and how can we, what kind of creature could have control over some kind of situation like that?
Mhm.
But I'm going off on a tangent. I do want to ask this question in the chat from Yvette, who might be a family member of yours, Ricardo.
My mom.
Has your family ever shared their old family spooky legend stories?
Well, she knows because she just talked to my grandma who just sent me a bunch. Thanks, Mom, for being in the chat. There's like, well, actually, growing up, I don't think we really had too many like scary stories that like we had like traditionally. I remember that there was like my dad used to tell me that there was like a scary man by the garbage can every time I took out the trash. But that was kind of just like that's more like, he just made it up on the spot. And those things really stick with me. But I don't
So
know.
Ricardo, when you saw Mulholland Drive, do you remember that?
Yeah, that's pretty much what I was thinking about.
On Mulholland Drive, was there like a sketchy guy in there?
Oh, you
Was
have
there?
not seen Mulholland
Wait,
Drive.
have you not seen it?
I have.
Oh,
That's
okay.
like,
There's a conversation in a diner, and I think it's a therapist. Correct me if I'm wrong, Ricardo. A therapist and a person who's like having a lot of problems that and thinks that there's something present outside of the diner, and the therapist is like, no, no, it's fine. And they go out, and the thing that he fears the most is there, right outside of
Okay.
the diner,
All right.
near like a trash can or something. It's horrifying and
it's like
great.
really the highlight of that whole
I
movie.
think
You
so.
watch, you watch it because of that. And it's like probably one of the scarier
Oh
scenes in
God. Oh yeah.
like movie history.
Agreed. Agreed.
It's funny how like that is not a scary, like it's not supposedly a scary movie, but elements can be scary in it. Okay, so Hannah, I did see your question in the chat, in the Q&A also. Ricardo, when it comes to your illustrated type, how do you begin sketching ideas? Do you start by doing studies of existing typefaces, or is it more shape composition based? Because your art is just so original. I just haven't seen anything like it.
No, thanks. And shout out to Hannah, also a good friend. Seems like I'm really bringing all the people out with the talk. Uh, type, I love type. I've went to school for graphic design. I went to Pratt in New York.
Mhm.
And that was kind of like my intro to type. And I love illustrated type. I love like combining like tons of old type or new type and just like into, to new shapes. So most of my process for doing that is like thinking, like I was talking about like the lechuza and the taco truck, like kind of thinking about like situations or like type that would be found in certain narratives, and then kind of incorporating that with an existing type maybe that I like, or just like sometimes it could be really organic and it's just could be like referencing like smoke or water or something, and it could just be like Art Nouveau kind of like flowy and stuff. I
Mhm.
try to think of it like the drawings where it try not to have too much structure and just like kind of have fun with whatever. And
Mhm.
this project was really great because it allowed me to just experiment with type so much,
Mhm.
and just I love really
Well, let
fun.
me build on that a little bit too, because you had mentioned that this was a collaborative effort between you and Steve, of course. And did working with Steve affect the way that you drew your creatures at all, or knowing how he would write about it?
No, not really. Steve was pretty good at just writing. Like I gave him stories and he kind of just like wrote from there. So, I mean, I guess I kind of led a lot of the content, but um he provided like a lot of details that helped the project like, you know, really be a lavish one where
Mhm.
like I could really like have fun with thinking about the situations that he did, and like making like the spots and like thinking about how like the type and the design and the borders and stuff could kind of relate to what he was saying. So it was kind of like a back and forth thing. I
Mhm.
don't think, Steve, do you think that you did
No,
anything
I,
like
I think I think we the reason this book exists is because we wanted to have your artwork kind of go full tilt. And what we did have, speaking to the premise of like covering many cultures, we did have sensitivity readers come in for the whole book, and no numerous sensitivity readers, because not one person would generally be comfortable claiming more than their own culture. And so we had a whole bunch of people come in, and we had them look at the art too. And so there were a couple instances where we asked to have the art adjusted because the sensitivity reader would say, well, this might be misunderstood.
Mhm.
So, we would suggest that you do something differently. And so we always did that. So,
Mhm.
but other than that,
I
I
also
can't
love
think of an instance.
restrictions. Working with Steve, working with Chronicle is like you can't really do, because it's not that kind of project. Like it's like it is a market, it's like a product, so you have to work with the restrictions of like what would sell, what we think would like work well with like an audience. Like we think about people that we want to sell it to. So like we think about, all these things that it's kind of like how it's like it's art, but I do think it's like more of a design thing. And like I learned a lot of that in college when like I was doing graphic design. Like it feels like a graphic design prompt, but
Mhm.
like you're just making art in that same kind of idea. And I
Mhm.
like that. I think it's fun to like have a client and then like do the best work for like whatever this product has to be.
Mhm.
So I don't feel like any restriction is a bad thing.
I do have to say, I agree with Steve that you should make posters because I find the art in this book particularly interesting because it's got like sort of like a classic vibe, but it's also so spooky, with like your placement of color and the way that everything's kind of like really squished together. I just love it. Um, okay, so Emma asks, what are your favorite cryptids now that you've done so much research?
Yeah. Well, I'd love the skunk ape. He has a special place in my heart, the skunk ape. I don't know. Let me think. I have the book in front of me. I like the werewolves, they're classic. Vampires are great. Um, those frogs, Loveland
The
frogs.
frogs. I'd never heard of the frogs before.
Well, the frogs are very, it's kind of like the chupacabra where they're so like there's not much information about them. So it was also really fun to draw because there isn't any information, so you could just do whatever you want pretty much.
Mhm.
Yeah, I don't want to ruin the story of the frogs. There's that was one where it was a challenge to write about because, generally some of the nonfiction or folklore pieces, are sort of skeptical. But that one's truly not. That
Nice.
one's absolutely debunked. But it's still fun though. It's still fun. That's part of why we tell these stories. It's just fun to think about some weird frogs with a magic wand walking around. That's better than what it probably was.
Yeah.
And I love
Very,
that illustration. It's great.
very
It's a real
spooky
magic.
frog and toad there. Mhm. Steve, what does your writing process look like, or did it look like for this particular book?
So I've written a few things for Chronicle. Had the opportunity to write a few things for Chronicle. And you would think that I would know better how long something would take. And so I remember thinking, well, this will take a couple weeks, like a month. Because I mean, it took, I don't know, 4 or 5 months of not like full-time effort, but because each entry needed its own, um, there's an arc of like, I don't know, maybe I know a little bit, or maybe I don't know what I don't know. And then it takes a while to figure things out. And also to try to say something at least slightly different than what's been said, just so people feel like they're getting something. Because I read a lot of books about this stuff, and I did see a certain similarity among many of the books that I'd read. And I'm like, well, I don't want to do that. First of all, because they've done that, and also I was assuming that some portion of the audience will have also read those books, and you want to give them some value. And so it took quite a while, and but it was fun. It was really fun to learn about this stuff. And like I didn't realize that in werewolf lore, werewolves were for some cultures and then sometime basically like male witches. So witches would be accused of witchcraft, tortured, killed, and the same for werewolves. So people would be accused of being a werewolf, men generally,
Mhm.
almost always. And the same thing, torture you until you admit that you're a werewolf, and then they kill you. And I had no idea that that was part of werewolf lore. Or that that there's a rich French uh, thread of werewolf lore,
They're French.
including where we think the silver bullet lore comes from, because there was a werewolf hunter that had dispatched a werewolf and used a silver bullet, and I think a bullet's probably a bullet, but because it was a silver bullet, that seems to be where that lore came from. I thought that was fun. Anyway, I was learning stuff all the time, and I thought it was really exciting to have the opportunity to do that. And
Mhm.
as Ricardo says, I, especially because of my job, I feel like I'm working in service of a project, and certainly here like an artistic vision. And so I kind of like restraint. Like I'm serving. This isn't there's like short fiction in it, so that's a little more expressive. But I feel like it's there's a project that I'm trying to fulfill the promise of, fulfill
Mhm.
my part of the promise of, and I kind of like that, like
Mhm.
having it's not like anything goes, right?
Right. So, Ricardo, I'm going to go back to you for process. Did you do a ton of research about different creatures and then start drawing them, or did you do the research and then go to Steve and say, what should we do?
Uh, well, I did a pitch. So the pitch was like five, like fleshed out, pretty much what you see, kind of just sketches of what the book was. So those I did research for, and then I like drew those. And then pretty much I think after that, Steve, then we just like have a Google Doc where we just had tons of research, and then
Mhm.
like me and Neil, which is our other editor, we just like went through them all, and we talked about which ones would work, which ones wouldn't work, and then like the ones that we knew were going to be good, we like would start on those, and then I draw those, and then I'd keep researching new ones until we got to like amount that we
Mm.
thought was good enough for the book.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, I was curious about that because you had said that you'd drawn the Yeti, but yet you weren't able to use it for reasons. So I was wondering how many pictures did you actually draw altogether, and how many did you not were you not able to use?
Not that much. I think there was maybe like 6 or 7 that we didn't use from like well, but I think we researched a lot more. Maybe we researched like 15 more.
I would say so. Yeah. And I think what happened then would be maybe you'd populate the Google Doc. I didn't notice that you'd like something you jumped the fence where like I didn't have a chance to say, I don't know about Spring Heel Jack, or I hadn't started researching it because I was behind or something. And when I got into it, I'm like, oh dear, Spring Heel Jack. It's kind of awful. So we would skip those, but you raring to go, you had already done your sketch. So there was a couple of those. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's funny that you had a monster that was like more monstrous than your other monsters.
There's yeah, there's like a level of social, like it's okay I don't even know how to say it. It's okay to go and eat people, but it's maybe not okay to go attack women in a certain way. Like for a book that's supposed to be a celebration of creepy, like it just was like, no,
Mhm.
It
Yeah.
goes back to like the client, like know who you're trying to make the book for,
just was like, that's not fun, let's move on, sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
Yeah.
that makes a lot of sense. I have two more questions for you. Um, what would you do if you actually somebody asks a great question. What would you do if you actually met Bigfoot?
Well, that is a silly question.
You'd be rich. You'd be rich.
Yeah, I'd probably be rich. I'd take a picture of him. And yeah. Next question.
Wait.
I'm trying to think, like, would anybody believe it? Like, would you, okay, say we have the gear, and you meet Bigfoot and you're all geared up and you get evidence, like,
I
would
take
anybody
the
actually
selfie
believe
with
it?
it like this. That's what I would do if I met Bigfoot.
I actually really just want to know if bear spray will work on him. You can run
Well, he
away.
probably stinks. So
He
Yeah,
putting
probably
hairspray on
stinks.
him is not going to be any good.
probably kind of already stinks. So,
Yeah.
um, anyways, last question is this book just came out. What perfect timing, right? But do you have any plans to collaborate again in Eerie Legends 2 or going in maybe a different direction?
Um, I don't know. There's tons of pitches all the time. I'm always sending them.
Ricardo is really a dream creator because you saw there's 3 viable projects in the slides that we just showed. And one of the things we're doing right now that Ricardo's working on is taking the key art for the horror oracle deck and turning it into a coloring book,
Ooh.
which is great because like the art's tremendous. He's going in and talking about you like you're not here, but going in and like refining details and taking out the color. And Ricardo's style, especially for that one, has this pointillistic shading. I don't know what to call it. Maybe Ricardo, you have a better term, but like it's just cool and unique, and it'd be great for a coloring book. So we're working on that.
Yeah.
That next generation of horror, right? Readers, right?
Definitely for children.
Before they
Coloring.
can read.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here. This has been enlightening for sure. And I didn't get scared at all. So I appreciate that too. Except for that
Thank
Jack Steele
you.
thing. Um, so I hope that we do see more from you both. And of course, I hope everybody has a wonderful Halloween and stays safe and reads eerie stories and legends. Um, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Yeah.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for inviting us.
Absolutely. And thanks for everybody who was here. I hope you had a great time.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thanks, everyone.
everybody.